So today I'm going to talk about the COVID-specific OSHA regulations. I know this is a familiar topic for a lot of you, and you're potentially sick of talking or hearing about it, but it is really important because, as Valeriana previewed, we have seen a lot of enforcement in this area, so it's a good opportunity to check in. I'm going to review I'm going to take this opportunity to review the applicable regulations. And I think you've probably seen in the news that we had the temporary rules come out in November, and then in May, we had the permanent rules, and they're mostly consistent, but there have been some changes. So we want to use this opportunity to just review what applies to you today, and hope that you can use this as kind of like a check-in to make sure that you're compliant with this. So I think we all feel like this dog a little bit right now, where we're sort of in this weird limbo right now where we're told that it's okay to come out, and we've seen the cases coming down and the vaccinations rates increase, but Erin will talk about that in a little bit. But it's sort of, what do we do now? And Valeriana has just given you a lot of good tips on how to come back into the workplace. But now I want to talk about what you've been doing for the last 6 months. We still need to continue to do. Again, things are improving, but we're not totally out of the woods yet. And the OSHA regulations aren't going to go away, at least not anytime soon. We also know that things can and do change pretty quickly. So I think it's possible that we could see a resurgence of cases as we move into the fall or see new strains come into play. And so we need to make sure that we remain flexible and understand that even if we see some exceptions coming into play now, they might get pulled back on. So staying up to date on the regulations is going to be really important. So the bottom line is that the regulations are still in place, and continued compliance is going to be really important. And I will talk about enforcement a little bit today. So make sure you enjoy the summertime, but just don't put away your pandemic playbook quite yet. So here's kind of a bird's eye view of what I plan to talk about today. I'm just going to do an overview of these topics. So kind of how we got here, the timeline, the major notable changes to the permanent rules that came out in May, the mask exception, which I think most of you have probably seen, which came out about 2 weeks later in mid-May. And then just remind you of some of the pre-COVID requirements. I know we've been focused so much on pandemic and pandemic-related issues that it's easy to overlook the requirements that have always been there. And then enforcement, and give you some ideas moving forward of what we could possibly see. So I think at this point, this timeline is probably pretty familiar to you. A few of us did a lot of these presentations in November when the temporary rules came out, and we used a timeline that looked a bit like this. So if you remember back in November, which I know feels like a century ago, like dog years, OSHA adopted some temporary rules that were scheduled to sunset at the beginning of May. Now, we already know that they turned them into permanent rules, but in between, in November and December 2020, you'll remember having to meet various deadlines for the exposure risk assessment and the infection control plan. There was mandatory training and required postings. And that moves us into the adoption of the permanent rules in May. So, fun trivia, you can't extend a temporary rule more than 180 days. So that's why we did turn them in, or OSHA turned them into permanent rules. As I said, they largely mirror the temporary rules. So luckily what you've come accustomed to following, you're going to be able to continue following. And I'm going to point out I don't want to say major, because I don't think there are any major differences, but the more notable changes that you're going to want to be aware of. The biggest thing happened about 2 weeks later. At the time of the adoption of the permanent rules, face coverings and social distancing for all individuals in the workplace, so employees, vendors, clients, customers, that was required of everybody, regardless of vaccination status. But then, as luck would have it, even though OSHA spent months and months drafting these rules, the CDC and OHA came out almost immediately after and modified their guidelines on face coverings and social distancing for folks that were fully vaccinated. So about 2 weeks later, OSHA hopped on board and created this vaccine mask exception, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a little bit, it is important that we follow those requirements very closely, because the general rule right now is face covering and social distancing are required unless you meet this vaccine mask exception. As far as what comes next, I know I included that, and then I was looking at it this morning and I'm like, I don't really know what comes next, because as much as I try, I can't quite see the future yet. So I can't definitively tell you what's going to happen, but I can say that I think we're going to continue seeing exception and amendments to the new rules, especially as new CDC and OHA guidance come out. I think it's possible we see another spike in cases in the fall, just like we did last year. We've also heard rumblings from vaccine manufacturers that everybody's going to need a booster shot in a year. So I think we're going to see amendments and rules having to do with that. So I guess the bottom line here is that we're going to keep seeing changes. So it's important to continue paying attention. And we know in May how fast things change. It seemed like every week we got an additional update on the mask or the face covering requirements. To that point, I've said this in every presentation, so I'm sure most of you already done this, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say this. It is really important to be signed up for those OHA and OSHA notifications. And it's really easy to do that, even though you do get a lot more additional emails. That really is the fastest way to stay up to date on the requirements. So I do recommend that if you haven't done that yet. Okay, so let's talk about the permanent rules that came into effect in about May 4th, 2021. I don't even know what year it is anymore. Like I said, these in large part mimic the temporary rules that we are already pretty familiar with. For example, the infection notification protocols are going to continue. So the final rule continues the temporary rules requirement that employers establish a process for notifying employees of a potential workplace exposure, and that notification must still happen within 24 hours. So it breaks that notification down to exposed employees versus affected employees. So for exposed employees, those individuals who had contact with the person who was later diagnosed with COVID, it's still the CDC's definition of close contact. So within 6 feet of that individual for a cumulative total of 15 minutes. So throughout the day, they were within 6 feet for a total of 15 minutes or more, versus an individual who just worked in the same facility or a portion of that facility. That would be the affected employee. So there are those different notification requirements for those two categories of employees. And we talked about that in a lot of detail in other presentations. But the main takeaway here is that OSHA has published example model policies and model notifications on their website. So if you haven't already gone there, it does have a lot of resources, especially now that these rules have been in effect for quite some time. So go to the page. You don't have to create these notifications and policies from scratch, but you do need to know they exist and you need to make sure that you're following this. At this point, there isn't an exception for vaccinated employees. So even if an exposed employee is vaccinated, the same notification requirements apply at this point. In the same way, the physical distancing and face covering requirements are still in effect. So they've retained, the final rule retained those basic requirements, keeping the 6 foot distance in the workplace, unless that's not feasible, as well as the other exceptions that were in the temporary rules, and the mandatory use of some kind of face covering, so masks or face shields. I'll talk about the vaccination exception to that in a couple minutes, but again, the general rule is that those requirements are still in effect. OSHA included some notes about the use of face shields. They are still allowed at this point, but it says that it remains an ongoing conversations with OHA about whether they're effective, and it retains the right to revoke the ability to use face shields in the workplace. So the bottom line there is that face masks are probably safer as far as following OSHA's requirements. They're clearly favored by OSHA. But if there is a reason to use a face shield, maybe it's an accommodation issue or another issue, they are still allowed under the final rules. The good news for employers, at least I hope this is good news, is that if you have completed the exposure risk assessment already and then infection control plan and training and the posting requirements, those are still required under the final rules, but those requirements are identical to the temporary rules that hopefully you've already complied with. OSHA has said that actions completed under the temporary rules don't need to be revised or repeated. So as long as you met those requirements in the first instance, you don't have to actually go and redo the work. So the idea here is you want to make sure that your assessment and your plan is up to date. There have been a lot of changes, so there may be areas in it that you need to update. We do want to make sure that we're making sure that they're current, but you don't have to redo the work. OSHA is enforcing this requirement, so we do want to make sure we have these on file. And if for some reason something happened in November and December and you weren't able to complete this, it's not too late. Still actually do complete it. OSHA has on its page, again, a lot of examples and templates and materials that you can use. So you don't have to start from scratch. I know a lot of employers felt really overwhelmed by the amount of detail that were required to go into these plans and assessments. But OSHA has done a lot of the work for you, particularly for the training and the plans. They have the templates. You just kind of a fill in the blank form. I've also gotten a lot of questions about whether you actually need to send these assessment and plans to OSHA. You don't. You just need to make sure you have them available and documented. And then if OSHA ever comes knocking, they're available to present to OSHA. So again, don't give it to them unless they ask for it, but make sure you have them available. I'm not going to spend any time today, just because we don't have that much time, talking about the assessment, training, and plans and the posting requirements in any more detail. But I know this is an area where employers have had a lot of questions. So if you do have questions, we're always happy to answer them. And we've worked with a lot of folks putting these plans together. So another area that we have seen that are in the permanent rules is the quarantine work from home requirement and post-quarantine right to return to work. So those requirements are still in the permanent rules. So basically the final rule makes clear that employees who participate in a quarantine or isolation for COVID have to be allowed to work from home if there is suitable work available and if the employee's condition does not prevent it. I mean, obviously we don't want an employee who's really sick forcing them to work from home, but if they're available and the employee feels up to it, making sure that that they have that opportunity. Employees also who participate in quarantine or isolation also have to be notified of their right to return to the job, assuming that that job's still available when their isolation or quarantine period ends. This brings us to the first notable change in the permanent rules. So effective last week on June 3rd, that notification of the right to return to the position if it's available has to be in writing. OSHA should be releasing a sample notification of what this would look like, but our team's always happy to help you put this together. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, about what the requirements of that notification are in a couple minutes, but I want to flag for you that that's the first big change. If you'll remember, the temporary rules included particular requirements for exceptional risk workplaces and industry-specific guidelines. There was a series of appendixes to the rules. The final rule does still retain those pretty complex requirements for those different kind of workplaces. So if you're an exceptional risk workplace, just keep in mind that you don't only need to follow the general rules, but the exceptional risk rules. And if you're in an industry that falls into one of the appendixes, you're going to want to make sure you're also following those requirements. I think the first question that I generally get from employers when talking about the permanent rules is, well, when are these rules going to go away? And that's a fair question. We have seen things start to reopen, and it does appear that things are getting better. Again, vaccination rates are up, case numbers are down. I think employees are also paying attention to this, so you should be prepared to get those questions from employees as well. Unfortunately, saying all that, I don't actually have a satisfying answer to that. The rules don't contain a sunset date like they did in the temporary rules. Instead, it says that it'll be repealed when it is no longer needed to address COVID-19 pandemic in the workplace. So very helpful, gives you lots of detail to bring back to your employers there. But OSHA has given some criteria on what it's going to look for before making a repeal. So you can pay attention to what's happening in the news and maybe potentially anticipate when that's going to happen. The idea is that OSHA is going to meet with some various stakeholders about every 2 months, beginning next month in July, and consider factors that include infection rates, test positivity rates, vaccination rates, hospital and fatality statistics, and taking all that information together, decide when it's safe to repeal or even amend some of these rules. Again, we don't know when that's going to be. And we should also keep in mind that OSHA has been a little bit, I don't say behind the ball, but they've been a few months behind the guidance. So even as we see CDC and OHA guidance change and the numbers go down, we can expect that OSHA is going to be a little bit more conservative and probably be a few months behind. If I had to guess, I would say employers should be prepared for these regulations to be in place at least through the end of the year, because I suspect they're going to be waiting to see what happens in fall and winter, because again, that's when we saw things get more intense last year. So I want to talk next about some of the more notable changes to the OSHA rule. I already previewed one of them. Again, they're mostly consistent, but there were some changes. And I'm going to be focused on the general rules, not the exceptional risk workplace or industry specific appendixes. But if you fall into one of those areas that applies to you, make sure you are comparing the temporary and the permanent rule. The first area is transportation. The rules now require employers to consider alternatives if you're transporting multiple people in a single vehicle. And they also provide guidance about how to reduce the risk if you do need to transfer multiple people. The rule doesn't require that you use multiple vehicles to transport people, just that you consider the alternatives. So just to be clear, so we know what we're talking about here, the focus of this requirement is on work-related travel, like to client meetings or to work sites. It's not talking about commuting to and from the office, although if you want to provide your employees some guidance and advice on that, you can. So the rule says that, again, effective June 3rd, so last week, if you're an employer that requires employees to travel together in a vehicle, you must use, and I just really like this language, the hierarchy of hazard controls to minimize employee exposure. So fancy language to say you should consider if there are alternatives. So can you make everybody take a single vehicle? Can you walk in the nice outdoor sun with the fresh air? If you do have to have multiple people in one vehicle, then you need to do a couple things. You need to make sure that everybody in the vehicle is wearing a mask. Need to make sure outside air is increased, so open the windows and make sure you're not circulating the same internal air. And you also have to make sure that everybody's seated as far apart as the car allows. So that's kind of what you need to do. Again, you don't have to make everybody be in separate vehicles, but if you do it, make sure you're following these guidelines. The same household exception still applies. So if everybody in the vehicle is from the same household, you don't need to follow this guidance. Talking next about HVAC systems. So the same requirements are in place, except for that by last week, June 3rd, if you have 10 or more employees, you need to state in writing that, to the best of your knowledge, your HVAC system is running in line with certain requirements. The final rule doesn't require you purchase or install a new ventilation system, just complete this certification. The good news is, again, this is not something you have to create from scratch. The certification is available on OSHA's website, and it doesn't need to be provided to OSHA unless they ask for it. So no need to put yourself in front of OSHA any more than you need to. Another thing, and I would put this on calendars because I think this would be an easy thing to forget, is that, again, starting last week, on a quarterly basis, so every couple months, employers must make sure that the air filters in the system are replaced as necessary to ensure a proper functioning of the ventilation system, and that all intake ports provide outside air to the HVAC system are cleaned and maintained and free of any debris. So basically, you just need to make sure that everything's running properly so that employees get the best benefit of that system. So certification and maintenance are the main takeaways from the HVAC system. So moving on to sanitation, the rules have also modified some of the sanitation requirements, basically just to make sure that they're in line with the requirements of the CDC. So high touch surfaces, common areas need to be sanitized about every 24 hours. Minimal drop-in areas require less. You still need to provide the equipment and materials for sanitation and hand hygiene. And there are probably more requirements for the exceptional risk workplace and some of the appendixes, so make sure you're looking in the right place. Obviously, you can do more than this. You want to do what makes your employees feel safe, but those are some of the baseline requirements. I've already talked about the written return to work notice, so I'm not going to repeat that. But again, June 3rd, so last week, that return to work availability does need to be in writing. Part of the writing is that it also needs to include relevant information about employers' paid time off, sick leave, and other available benefits. So make sure your writing is compliant with the requirements. And again, I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page here. It doesn't mean that you need to keep a job available that otherwise would not have been available. Like if it's the end of seasonal work, I feel like it's the best example there. But it does mean that you can't fill a job if you have another employee, thereby making it unavailable. So you can't make something unavailable, but if the job wouldn't have been available anyway, then that's not what this rule is talking about. The last notable change that I just want to highlight is that healthcare employers do need to have the PPE supply and crisis management plan in place. And again, that was starting June 3rd. The rules provide a link to some OHA guidance that I think will help you establish that plan, so you don't need to start from scratch there. So for the mask and vaccine exception, I've already highlighted this, but starting a couple weeks ago, this went into play. So basically what the requirement, what this exception requires is that it reminds everybody that the mask and social distancing guidelines are still in effect, but the guidance provides that if you have a policy in place, a written policy in place for requesting and checking proof of vaccines, and then you actually do request and review that proof, you can permit fully vaccinated individuals to go without a mask or a face covering in the workplace. And then you also don't have to enforce that physical distancing. So there's a couple things that I want to highlight here. First, make sure you're paying attention to the definition of what fully vaccinated means. It means that you received both doses if it's a 2-dose or the 1 dose if it's a single dose, and that you waited the adequate mandatory waiting period, so the 14 days after. Second, make sure you understand that this is voluntary. So you can still require the masks and the social distancing if employees are taking advantage of that mask exception. You also I wouldn't force employees to take advantage of this. So even if you do put a policy in place saying that employees have the option of showing proof, if employees feel more comfortable with the mask and socially distancing, then they should be allowed to do that. The other major thing that I want to highlight is that this is not an honor system. You do actually need to review that proof of vaccination. If you don't want to verify or somebody doesn't want to prove it, that's fine, but you need to continue complying with the face covering and social distancing requirements. Don't forget about your written policy. It should be the requirements of the guidelines, perhaps a definition of what it means to be fully vaccinated, what your verification process is going to be, and a promise to keep the information confidential. Lorina's already touched on the importance of keeping medical information confidential, so I'm not going to repeat it. But I do want to highlight that is an important piece, is that vaccine information is medical information, so it does need to be kept confidential as much as you can. I would keep an eye on this guidance. This is a high-level overview of what we're seeing, but keep an eye on the guidance. It changed very rapidly last month. If the numbers go up, I could see OSHA and OHA pulling back on that guidance. So it is an area to keep your eye on. So these are some of, and I just kind of created a list here, and I've already talked about a lot of these, but these are some of the biggest potential pitfalls that I see in the mask exception. So forgetting confidentiality, not providing training to whoever's doing the verification on what it means to be fully vaccinated. That's important. We've got to make sure they're calculating that mandatory wait time. record keeping, making sure you're documenting what your efforts are, and just allowing employees to do what they need to do based on their personal comfort level. So if an employee wants to socially distance and wants to wear a mask in the workplace, at this point, we should let them. So just briefly, I know I'm running out of time here, but I want to touch on enforcement because that is a question I get. Well, what's the enforcement like? Is OSHA really looking at this? Well, they are. And in 2021, we have seen enforcement go up and fines for violations go up. So I've kind of put the range. I scanned them a few days ago on OSHA's website, sort of what the range is. It's all available, which is why I included the words public shaming there, is that their press releases do include the name of the employers, the violation, and what the fine is. So we do want to keep our names off of there and make sure that we're following these rules. And again, I know I'm going fast with this material, but if you have any questions, we can always help you through this. Again, don't forget about some of your pre-COVID requirements. So the anti-discrimination, particularly as we return people to the workforce or we're enforcing the mask and social distancing requirements, we want to make sure we're treating everybody equally. The confidentiality. I've talked about this in a few other presentations, but the OSHA recordable incident. If somebody contracted OSHA or COVID in the workplace, it's potentially a recordable incident depending on the circumstances. So make sure you're paying attention to that and don't overlook that. And just as every attorney will say ever, you'll probably hear this in every single presentation today, make sure you're documenting everything you're doing to comply with the OSHA regulations, documenting everything you're doing to protect your employees. That's going to be some of your best evidence if there's ever an issue that arises. So the last thing I just want to briefly mention is just looking forward. As we continue to move towards bringing employees back and loosening up some of the OSHA regulations as that comes, remember to manage your employees' expectations. Communication is the best defense against employee claims. So remember, welcome them back to work, but remind them that things have changed and it's possible that we could all be working remotely again. We could be requiring masks. In the same way, listening to employees, this has been a really stressful 18 months. There's been juggling work and children, family, health, financial issues. So making sure you have your EAP program available and you're listening and you're being, empathetic to that transition back to work will create a happier workforce, but will also avoid some of those claims, which often do stem out of bad communication and an employee feeling like they're not being heard or valued. Stay flexible and up to date on the guidance. You have all the tools to do that, so just make sure you're looking at it. Again, I think we're going to see changes as we move towards the fall. I know we all want to delete our Zoom accounts, but I don't think we're quite there yet. All right, well, thank you all for listening. That's the end of my OSHA presentation, but Erin's going to be up next. Erin joined our team during COVID, and she's an awesome addition. So I know she's going to have some valuable information for everybody on vaccines. Okay, thank you.